Record. So, all right. Well, thank you all for coming tonight to the Vermicomposting It's for the Worms program. And this is part of the virtual series. So most of our programming without, hands-on stuff, which would be some of our workshops that we're doing, most everything A&R is going to migrate virtually. We just have a lot of folks in the county these days, and it's really tough to try to get people to make it to the programming at different locations. So this way we can have as many people as would like to come. And then we record and post that on the Metro Master Gardener Facebook page so that if you do miss it, and we had, I think, about 35 people signed up. We don't have that many here. We have about 19 right now, but if for whatever reason you signed up and you couldn't make it, got stuck in traffic or whatever, you can go back and watch it later. So the beauty of the internet and Zoom. So with further ado, I will go ahead and start. So vermicomposting, it's for the worms. So it's just another form of composting. I know a lot of us do that, and it's pretty cool. Gives us some really good stuff to put back in the garden. So composting is a natural process where you're basically recycling organic matter. So leaves, food scraps, things like that you might get out of your kitchen, eggshells, coffee grounds, all of that stuff that is going to decompose in a landfill works wonderfully in a compost bin. It can also work great in a worm bin, and it can actually speed up the composting process and give you some really good stuff that you can use in your garden outside of just your typical nice organic matter. But it does speed up the process, which is really nice. So black gold is compost that is rich in nutrients. That's basically the worm castings. And that can be used in gardening, in your vegetable gardens, any type of horticulture, roses, any type of agriculture. So I don't know too many farmers that are going to use it on monoculture in a huge farm situation because it's really expensive. If you've looked up the price of what a bag of worm castings costs, let's just say about 5 pounds, you're probably looking at somewhere between $20 and $25. So if you can do that yourself, hey, why not, right? Okay, so what's in compost? Most of us know, some of us might not know, and that's okay too. So that's going to be your browns and your greens. So materials like leaves, straw, shredded wood, although that kind of takes a while to break down, grass, maybe from, clippings from, when you cut your grass out front, vegetable scraps from the kitchen, carrot peelings, potato peelings, that kind of stuff. They're all combining with water and air and high temperatures in an environment that breaks the material down. This is like just a standard compost heap, right? So you can see there on the infographic on the right what kind of brown materials are. So that would be like aged hay. Maybe you have chickens or something like that, and you had hay, or you have hay that you were using in for mulch in a bed in your vegetable garden. Oat hay. So oat hay, wheat straw, that kind of stuff all falls into the same category. Cardboard. Some people like to use cardboard in their garden to keep the weeds at bay. You can use dry shredded leaves, sawdust, wood that's been chipped, cardboard egg containers, shredded paper, paper towels, straw, paper toilet paper rolls, or wood ash, but not coal ash, and dried grass. Those are all brown materials. Green materials would be like vegetable trimmings from your garden. Algae, I don't know too many people that would have algae. I don't know, maybe you bought a package of those dried algae strips at Kroger and thought they weren't very good. we can count that as algae. Green leaves, grass clippings, kelp seaweed, green shrub prunings, tea bags, alfalfa hay, coffee grounds and filters. Yeah, even the filter. It's a paper product. Animal manure, herbivores. Just make sure that it is that source of manure that you're adding in. And again, this is just for a compost pile, standard compost, not necessarily worms. Make sure that they're not using certain types of herbicides. If you have questions about that, you might drop those in the chat box and we can talk about it at the end of the program. Just to kind of reiterate, I am recording, and if you do have questions, just for the sake of allowing me to get through the presentation, you can just drop those in the chat box and I will get to those at the end. And rounding out the green materials, preferably I say don't put weeds in there, but if it is just the green part and there are no seeds associated with it, that's fine. Old flower bouquets, animal hair, you know, I'm not a fan of that. It does take a while to break down. And aquarium water, because there's a lot of waste in there from the fish. So microorganisms and macroorganisms, insects, bacteria, fungi, all sorts of stuff. Everything that you see here on this slide is in compost. Anything from the tiny microorganisms all the way up to insects that you can see, like centipedes and millipedes and pill bugs, that kind of thing, worms, those are all in compost and they all play a part in breaking all of that material down. So what are the benefits of composting? Well, lots of benefits, really. You can save money by providing organic material that you're going to put into your garden. Maybe just have raised beds, and over time, that soil that you have in there that you purchase the level starts to drop. Well, you can add in organic materials from your compost pile and save a little bit of money so you don't have to go buy some at the store. It improves soil fertility. So I did a soil science presentation last time, and the soil science talked a lot about Georgia geology and what kind of rock we have here in Georgia, the different ecological regions, geologic regions, how it all kind of comes together in soil. Soil is the basis of everything, but organic material is really important in topsoil. And in Georgia, we lack a lot of topsoil. We just don't have it. There are other regions of the US that provide a much deeper section of topsoil. An inch to inch and a half would be great, but there are a lot of places around Middle Georgia here in North Georgia, we just don't have it. So we have to amend that by adding in organic materials to improve that soil fertility. You're going to protect the environment by recycling and reducing waste. So doing your own part, that's a good thing. And it can help strengthen the soil's ability to retain water. So when you have a really heavy clay soil, clay particles are very, very small. Like if you were to compare it to Florida, where you have really sandy soils, sand has very large pores between the sand grains. They're very large, whereas clay is very small. If you add in organic matter like compost to a soil that's very heavy in clay along with some sand, that helps provide moisture retention for that soil. And it also allows plant roots to move through there better. And so you can really discount the amount of time you have to go and water your plants if you put some type of an organic material in there. Reducing landfill waste, cutting methane emissions, and you can reduce the need for synthetic fertilizers, which is always a good thing. You can help store carbon through sequestration. That's just kind of a fancy word for locking that down in that organic matter. That's a good thing. You can reduce personal food waste, recycling discards, and instead of putting them in the trash. So just as a comparison's sake, in my family of 4, they give us a 95-gallon trash can. we put maybe 2 bags. Usually it's more like 1.5 bags in that container every week for a family of 4. And we do cook a good deal. So between the worms that I have, my famous worms that travel with me to the home show and other places, my chickens, which do some composting because they eat a lot of the non-rotted stuff that the worms get, and recycling of cardboard and other containers, we just don't have a lot of trash. So we can really cut down on that. And for those folks that may be in a community where trash pickup, maybe they weigh it, maybe you're required to recycle. That's a good thing. So we all kind of have to do our part. So again, why compost? Well, it's an easy way to turn waste into usable organic nutrients. It's going to improve that soil texture and air circulation in heavier soils, like I mentioned. It's a mild, slow release natural fertilizer, and so it's not going to burn plants, or it shouldn't burn plants. You're going to use less chemical fertilizers. That's a good thing. So ultimately, that means less nutrient runoff into rivers, lakes, and streams. If you're new to Georgia, we have a lot of rain here. We can get 52 inches plus a year. So in some areas, that doesn't, seem like a whole lot. You get down in Florida, in some areas, it might be 70 or 80 inches, but you get up in the Midwest and it might be somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 inches and it's flat. Well, here it's pretty hilly. So a lot of that topsoil can, and anything else that you've put on your lawn or anywhere in your garden, that can wash off if you get an inch or 2 of rain in a very short period of time. So it makes sense to be smart and try to do what you can to eliminate a lot of the uh, um, chemicals and excess fertilizers and things like that that end up in the river system. So here's some facts and statistics. So I always like to have a, guess what type factoid in session at least once or twice, maybe more, depending if there's a lot of little interesting factoids out there. But you can see there's been a 65% increase in composting programs worldwide in the last 5 years. That's excellent news. That means that there's a lot of environmental awareness. Education is helping, and folks are being smarter. So they're recycling their edibles, leftovers, things like that. If it can be composted, that's what they're doing. And a lot of municipalities are actually collecting and doing this also sometimes for you, which is definitely nice. Now you're paying for it, but it's very responsible. There are about 185 composting facilities in the US, and most are privately owned. So a lot of municipalities will contract with them, but you're certainly welcome to do it on your own property as well. New business in the US can sustain 18 full-time jobs by utilizing 10,000 tons of compost each year. So it is fueling job growth. That's a good thing. If 8 households in the US composted food scraps, it would offset an average household's electricity use annually. That's pretty interesting. And you can also see that 4.4 pounds of organic waste an average American generates per day. Only about 1.5 pounds is compost. So there's still work to be done. And in the US, only 4.1% of annual food waste is composted. Of course, we'd love to see that number go up. That means, if you can get that number to go up, that's less trash in the landfills. And even though it does ultimately break down, it's with a lot of stuff that doesn't. So, just trying to do our part. And just a few other things. Down here by 2024, the compost market is anticipated to be worth about 9.2 billion. So that's quite a bit, but if you look at it on a worldwide scale, really, it's not that much. So, again, we definitely want to do our part. All right, so there's different types of composting. You have cold or passive composting, hot or active composting, and vermicomposting. And then there's other little subsections, if you will, and different ways of doing the composting. And so I'm not going to get into the weeds, pun intended, of that because we're here to talk about worms. But there are different things that you can do, different types of composting, different methods from around the world. So always something interesting. Cold or passive composting. So cold composting is going to break down organic material very slowly. It can take quite a while, and it's anaerobic, which just basically means anaerobic or without air. It takes the least amount of effort and maintenance on your part, but it can take a year or two before you have usable compost. So in this case, it would be, you have a bin out in the back of your yard and you throw greens, flowers, weeds, leaves, grass, all of that kind of stuff, a mixture of the browns and the greens, if you can remember back a couple slides to the infographic I showed you. And you can see all the different things that can go in there. So basically, you're just going to throw that all in there. Some people will have 2 or 3 of these bins, and they'll kind of slowly move stuff. When one starts to break down, they'll start throwing it in another. You might occasionally turn it, but it definitely does take a couple of years for this to turn into something useful. Hot or active composting, it's faster but it's a much more managed process. So here, you have particular heights of your pile that it needs to be, at least 3 foot tall by 3 to 4 feet wide. Piles like this can have an internal temperature with thermophiles up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So those bacteria can get that really hot inside as they decompose that organic matter. But as compared to 1 to 2 years, you can actually have usable compost in as little as 4 weeks, but possibly up to 12 months. And that'll depend a little bit on the amount of moisture that's in there. You want to kind of keep carbon and nitrogen in optimum ratios in what you're putting in browns versus greens. And it's including a balance of air and water. So you don't want it too wet. You don't want it too dry. You don't want the pile to be too short. You don't want it to be too wide. And you're probably going to go in there and continuously kind of push it up into a pile and stoke the fire, if you will, so that you can get those microorganisms to up the furnace and really, break down all of that organic matter that's in there. You see here a little picture of a thermometer, and you definitely want one of those if you're doing hot or active composting so that you can kind of keep tabs on what that temperature is in the middle of that pile, because that's going to determine how quickly it's going to break down. All right, now on to vermicomposting. So sometimes I've heard people just kind of toss around vermiculture, vermicomposting, and they're not really interchangeable, I guess. And so this is kind of what we're going to talk about today. So vermiculture is actually the culture of earthworms, and the goal is to continually increase the number of worms that you have in order to get a sustainable harvest. So for instance, if you ever go fishing and you go to Walmart and you buy one of those little styrofoam cups of worms, red wigglers, that you take out to the lake and you go fishing for some brim or something else, that's what that is. So somebody's decided they want to have a business and they want to raise worms and sell them as fish bait or something else. That's vermiculture. You're trying to raise those worms for the benefit of increasing them to have a sustainable harvest so that you can sell them. Vermicomposting is the process by which worms are used to convert organic materials like wastes, kitchen waste, that kind of stuff, into a humus-like material, and that's vermicompost. So that process is going to produce a natural, odorless, very nutrient-rich casting or worm poop in about 3 to 6 months. And you can have a tiny little container, or you can have a really big container. There's all sorts of different sizes. You can buy them. They're called worm towers. You can make them. You can go simple, complex. You can spend hundreds of dollars. You can make it for free. There's all sorts of different ways of going about this. But if you are really interested in providing the best for your fruits and vegetables that you're growing, your ornamentals on your property, having some worms to do the work for you and make the castings for you to add in is a good idea. So the value of vermiculture. So earthworms provide a natural method for recycling organic materials. So again, food prep leftovers like your carrot peels, scrap paper. So, maybe you work at home and you shred a lot of paper. That's great. You can mix that in there. Your worms will eat that. They'll use that as bedding. And garden crop remains. So if you've maybe harvested a bunch of cabbages, and you left behind the remaining pieces of vegetation, that works. Yard trimmings, you were out there cutting the grass and you bagged it up. They love that stuff. That's great. High in nitrogen. And earthworm castings, they're eco-friendly fertilizer. They'll stimulate the natural activity in soil microorganisms, promoting the activity of enzymes and natural plant growth regulators. And they regulate the availability of essential plant nutrients. So they do all sorts of good things for your plants. So just a little bit of scientific information here. So obviously we wouldn't be pushing having worm castings and using them if they didn't do remarkable things. So you can see here, this is just a simple science experiment that plants that were grown with worm castings grew 3 times faster than identical plants grown in potting mix, a commercial potting mix. So you can see on the right, that's where they use the worm castings versus the potting mix on the left. And there's a big difference. I mean, those plants are huge. I would love to have my tomatoes grow that much faster than they typically do. So, this is something really, really neat. So if you're willing to invest in getting some worms and going through the steps of feeding them and harvesting their castings, you'll have you'll be the envy of the block for your vegetable plants. Here's another example. And you can see here through North Carolina Extension, the small turnip on the left, they didn't use any vermicompost there. And then the medium turnip, 10% by volume, and a large turnip, 20% by volume. So, the more you use, the bigger your harvest. So that obviously there's a really strong correlation there. And, if you want bigger and better and much more impressive crops, then using vermicompost, worm castings, or some of the other byproducts, which we'll go into in a bit, would be a good idea. So earthworm species. So, you may be thinking, oh, I'll just go dig up some of the worms that I've got in my garden right now, and I'll just put them in a bin and we'll feed them and it's all good. Well, yes and no. So there are different types of or categories of earthworms. There's over 9,000 different species of earthworms out there. And the only group of earthworms that are identified is as I always stumble on this word, epigeic, are suitable for vermicomposting, not endogeic or anesic. So these guys live in the topsoil or the very top of the soil horizon, and they deposit their castings on the surface. They don't burrow into the ground. I've got a little bit more information here. So they'll live on the surface in that duff layer. So trying to think of if there are any others that I can't think of any others off the top of my hand. There are some red wigglers and there's some other types of I call them more invasives. Earthworms aren't my strong suit. I know quite a bit about red wigglers, but these guys live in the top topsoil section. They really do not burrow into the ground at all, and therefore you're only really going to see their castings on the surface of the ground. There are other types. There's the endogaic or earthworms, and these guys live in the soil, so you're really not going to see them. They're going to stay usually down, and I believe it's like the not the O horizon, basically be the one right below topsoil. And they're just going to move around within that strata. You sometimes will see them if they come up, like for instance, if the soil gets saturated, you'll see them come up because they breathe air just like we do, and they can't tolerate being in a saturated soil. I believe night crawlers would fall in this category. So they basically have a fairly small territory, just kind of moving around within that particular strata, whereas the red wigglers or the epigeic earthworms, those guys live on the top layer. They have a much wider territory. They're constantly moving over the surface. They're just not really burrowing, but they're also very prolific. So they do a really good job of breaking down the forest litter that you see. Anisic, they have both traits of these types of earthworms. So you'll see them moving up and down in the soil column, and they will have semi-permanent burrows. And they will also drag leaves into their burrows to feed. So they kind of do a little bit of both. The most commonly used earthworm in vermicomposting is going to be your red wiggler, Acinia fetida, and that means foul smelling. They're pretty stinky. So just kind of keep in mind that if you're going to have earthworms for vermicomposting, you probably want to do that on your porch, maybe your garage or something like that. So environment, earthworms prefer a moisture content that's going to be somewhere between 60 and 85%. So 80% would be pretty good. So whatever media you put them in or bedding needs to have a decent amount of moisture to it. So as you're adding in whatever, rotten tomatoes or carrot peelings or whatever else, if you put that in there, that's going to add a certain amount of moisture to it. You can check it with a moisture meter, but honestly, you really don't need to do that. There are different things that people will choose to put in there for bedding. Some of it you can purchase, some of it you can get for free. I personally use peat, and I'll reconstitute it, put that in there for them. It's pretty easy to tell when that starts to dry out. So if it starts to dry out because it's really hot outside, I'll put a little water in there to kind of keep it moist. But really what you're putting in there when you're feeding them, that's going to keep it pretty moist. So the ideal temperature for earthworms and bioactivity is going to be about 70 degrees. So early summer is great for them. They are voracious. They eat a lot. They will tolerate between 40 degrees and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So as you move through the summer and it's pretty hot out, you'll notice that their biological activity decreases. They're just not feeding as much because it's hot. It doesn't kill them necessarily, but they aren't happy. So they usually just kind of hang out, and you notice that not much is happening in there. And same goes for when it's really cold. So my worms hang out in a bin on my porch, which is covered, but it's still open to the elements. So when it was super, super cold over Christmas, I actually moved them into my garage temporarily because I didn't want the poor little guys to freeze. So they did just fine. I moved them back out, and they can tolerate below 32 for a while. So we had, colder temperatures last night. They're fine. They just kind of hang around in there, and as long as it doesn't freeze into a block of ice, they're pretty easy keepers, you call them. But worm bins should be maintained at around a pH of 7. I don't know too many people that are going to go and check the pH, but you're certainly welcome to. You can buy little kits off Amazon or Walmart or Home Depot or any of those. Sometimes when your pH is off, you might have other occupants that start increasing their populations, and we'll talk a little bit about those. So if you're putting highly acidic things into the bin, you might want to kind of keep track of that by periodically checking the pH. So things you can use for warm bedding. You can use peat moss. That's what I use. You can use cocoa coir. That's kind of a block that you then shred, very similar to peat moss. Dry dead leaves, you can use a commercial bedding. You can use shredded paper, corrugated cardboard, wood shavings if you have it, hay or straw, pine straw, wheat straw, that'll work. And then, oh, look, I duplicated commercial bedding. Sorry about that. Things to remember, about 50% of whatever bedding that you have in there can be used as food for the worms, which is why you'll see whatever you put in there, the level of it will begin to shrink. It'll start to shrink down. You'll notice the consistency change, that kind of thing. You need to make sure that aeration is a thing. So you do not want to let it get anaerobic. If you let it get anaerobic, you'll start getting some other organisms in there that you probably don't want, and it will stink. It will stink really bad. So make sure that you are aware of what is going on in that bin. You can't just stick it in there and forget it. And always make sure to check that moisture content. So these are my favorites, the shredded coir, cocoa coir from coconut fibers, and peat moss, very similar consistencies. It kind of boils down to, I guess, which you prefer, you know, how much you have. You can buy a peat moss cube or you know, they're pretty big. I mean, I have one, I think I ordered it off Amazon. I'll be using that thing for probably 10 years. And it cost me, I don't know, maybe 15 bucks. So you can, you're very economical, but again, it just boils down to where are you going to source it, which is easiest to find it. If you can find peat moss easier, use that. It's not going to hurt anything. You know, I guess that's pretty much all I have to say about that. You can mix that bedding with other stuff. So for instance, you can get that shredded coir and mix it with paper shreds. So if you're shredding stuff at home, mix that all up. Make sure that, you know, there's a dampness to it. Again, you want to keep that moisture about 80%, give or take. And you can mix that in with the peat moss too. I personally don't. I don't really worry about it, but if you have the paper and you want to do that, you can do that. You can do that with newspaper too. It's a good way of recycling that. If you don't want to, you know, put it in the bin every day and it's heavy and you don't want to carry it up to the curb, these guys will help knock down some of what you're bringing up to the curb because they'll use it as bedding and eat that. What worms eat? So again, they're pretty much like a regular old compost pile. There's certain things that you put in there and there's certain things you do not put in there. So they like vegetables, they like leaves and yard waste, eggshells, paper, tea bags, coffee grounds and fruits. The benefit here is you can feed these guys rotten stuff too. So rotten tomatoes, if they're starting to get moldy, you can do that in a compost bin, but somehow I get a little bit more satisfaction when I feed it to the worms. I feel like they're excited and happy. Sorry about that. I had somebody that was unmuted. So you can pretty much give them anything that you would put in a regular compost pile, and they will be perfectly happy about that. And the things that you don't want to feed them, again, pretty much the same things that you wouldn't put in a regular compost pile. So meat and dairy, citrus, sauces, oils, food with preservatives, spicy foods, breads. You know, there's, you know, some people will put bread in the compost bin, the worm bin, and I guess you could do that. They'll eat it. So if it's not a ton of bread, you can probably do that, but don't go overboard on it. So if you have a whole loaf that's been sitting out and it got stale and you don't want to throw it out, you probably could put that in there, put it in a little bit over, you know, a week. they'll eat it. Pasta, you probably could do the same thing. But, you know, if you burnt up that whole pot of spaghetti last night, I wouldn't go dumping that in there. You probably will end up with stinky, smelly byproducts versus happy worms if you do that. So this is a nice little infographic on what to feed your worms versus what not to feed your worms. I'm a big fan of infographics. They make it very simple to kind of get the point across. And, you know, this is something that you can put on your, hang on a second. Please don't unmute yourself. And if you're entering, please make sure that you're on mute. So that I don't hear you. Thank you. So you can find these infographics on the internet. They're all over the place. I like the cute ones like this, but you can print that off and put that on your fridge, or if you have a bowl, or however you're collecting whatever you're going to put out there in the worm bin, you know, you can have this right there. So even if your kids or your husband or your wife or whoever is there, they can look real quick and tell what they should and should not put out there in the bin. So this is kind of just a handy little thing that you can get off the internet print. So feeding examples. The smaller the item is, or the more shredded or broken down, the quicker the worms will utilize it. They love tomatoes. I mean, I've put different things in there, and then I've put a rotten tomato or a tomato that's breaking down in there, and they will all flock to the tomatoes. They love the tomatoes. Not a huge fan of rotting bananas. They'll eat the interior out. Takes a while on the peel, but rotting coleslaw, kale leaves, anything that is soft or easily eaten, they will flock to that. They like that kind of stuff. So food prep for your worms, the smaller pieces are better. You know, do you grind, puree, shred, or freeze for them? I don't know. I don't do that. I think that they're worms and they're handy and they'll figure it out. But they're, you know, of course, you can help them out if you want to by making the pieces smaller so that it's easier for them to eat. All right, so it takes two, worm reproduction. So let's all take the Wayback Machine to our 6th grade or 7th grade science class so we can talk about hang on a second. Somebody has access to this. I apologize. Okay. Sorry about that. So with red wigglers, they're hermaphrodites. So this basically means that they have both male and female organs. They line up their clatella, which is that kind of swollen area or that band. So the worms are going to kind of line up that clatella or that swollen area, and they're going to release a mucus film that covers both of their bands. They then are going to kind of wriggle out of that band, and that'll leave behind a little bitty cocoon that's going to protect those eggs. So each egg is going to have about 2 to 4 baby worms, and each egg sac is going to contain about 20 eggs on average. So an earthworm can actually produce eggs about every 7 to 10 days and have up to about 1,000 baby worms every 6 months. So they're going to produce their offspring about every 3 months. So for someone who's doing vermiculture, if you remember back to what that was, vermiculture meaning that they're raising worms specifically for the ability to sell those worms either to somebody who wants to do vermicomposting, and there's a lot of companies you can get. I think there's Uncle Dave's and there's a few others, but you can go on Amazon and you can purchase worms also for fishing purposes at bait shops and things like that. It's a nice little business to be into because you don't have to do a whole lot for them. You know, they're pretty much self-sufficient. You just have to make sure that you're feeding them and keeping them happy, and they reproduce really well for you. And then you have to separate them out. We'll talk about how you do that in a second. So the egg sac is going to be about the size of a grain of rice, so pretty tiny. It starts out as white and then will darken to yellow and then finally brown and red. And that's when the worms are ready to hatch. So that process can, depending on soil temperature, and it can be 3 weeks for up to a year. So the eggs typically will hatch in warmer weather, and that's kind of to be expected with anything that's not a, you know, yeah, I don't know. I probably 3 weeks to a year. I mean, year would probably be, that'd be up somewhere in the upper Midwest, maybe, or the Northeast where it's pretty cold. So down here, you know, you could have quite a few different, maybe 2 or 3 generations of earthworms each year. Georgia has fairly nice weather, so we're able to grow things year round, including worms. Cocoons may have as many as 10 eggs, and you know, you can usually end up getting about 2 to 6 worms that emerge. So I can tell you that they reproduce pretty darn quickly. And before you know it, you'll have a ton of little bitty tiny worms. And as long as you're feeding pretty regularly, you can split those off and give to your friends who want to have worms themselves. And, you know, it's kind of nice to be able to share them. I've done that with quite a few. Did you know, oops, that earthworm populations can double every 3 months? Now you do. All right, so you see these little white worms, they are not babies. So if you have had worms in the past and you haven't really managed their populations and you kind of just let them do whatever, these are actually called potworms, Potworms, and they're relatives of earthworms, but they are not earthworms. And what they are is they actually indicate there's an imbalance in the conditions in your worm box. So they're not going to harm the population of your red wigglers, but they do compete for food. So just be aware of that. These guys will show up if the pH is too acidic. So if you haven't been watching, remember I mentioned something about pH and making sure that it stays around neutral, which is 7. So if it gets too acidic and it drops down into the 5 range, you might see more of these guys. If your worm bin is very wet, you might see too many of these guys. You might also see soldier fly larvae. That's also interesting. If you get the soldier fly larvae, you know, in the maggot form, and they decide to all leave, I hope that they can get out of your garage. That can be kind of out of a horror movie. So keeping an eye on the balance of what's in your box is probably a good thing. Not overfeeding. If you've got too many nutrients there, you might notice that you start seeing more of these. If so, you want to kind of add some more bedding material. So add some cardboard, add some paper. You kind of want to soak up some of that moisture. Cut back on feeding them. So just, you know, go a week or 2, don't feed them. And when the worms will be fine, don't worry about it. And you'll start noticing that the potworm populations will start to drop. Remove fermenting extra food. So that fermentation is going to change that pH a little bit. So if your worm population, your red wiggler population is not enough to eat what you're putting in there, you know, slow down, don't put as much in there, remove what they haven't eaten, give it a chance to kind of get back into balance. Aerate the soil. Easier said than done. I guess if you had a fancy setup with a bubbler and a fish tank, you could do that, but really just get a a little trowel or another garden tool and go in there and kind of rough it up. Flip that bedding material over, and that will add in some much needed air into that bedding material. And you can also add crushed eggshells to neutralize the pH if that's the problem. That's calcium and lime. So that's basically what we add to our garden to increase the pH. Same thing will work here. Just understand, the bigger the chunks, the longer it takes to do that. I guess you could theoretically sprinkle a little bit of powdered lime on there if you wanted to do that, but be very careful. pH, I'm not going to go into the pH scale here, but you don't want to do too much drastic to that, because worms are a biological organism and they do not respond well if you change the pH, which is on the logarithmic scale or exponential. They don't take too well to having the pH changed very fast. So habitats, there's lots of different things you can put worms in. You can be fancy, you can be not so fancy. There's DIY worm boxes where you make them yourself. You can purchase some fancy ones. They've got worm towers and worm bags and all sorts of stuff. I mean, just kind of, a little bit of everything. You can find plans off the internet, but you don't really need those. You can do something simple like this. Just go get several bins. This one has 4 bins, but you don't have to have 4. You can have 2. One lid for the top so they can't get out, and then some small plastic containers and some shredded newspaper. So here you've taken a couple of those tubs and you've drilled some holes in those tubs. And then now you see here that the leachate, you can see that it's that kind of dark tea looking stuff in the bin there to the right. That is all the moisture that's going to trickle down through and catch in that bottom bin. And that is good. It's worm tea. Leachate, it's kind of like worm tea, but it's good for putting on your houseplants. It's a mild fertilizer. People will buy that as well. You can buy that on Amazon if you didn't think that you could buy everything there. You can buy worm leachate also. So having those little containers, you can see that the top bins will sit on those, and then allowing that leachate to drip down through and catch there that you see. So this is how it works. In the top bin, you're going to have the bedding material, holes up at the top for air for your worms, and then a cover so they can't escape. And then in the castings are going to drop through those holes that you drilled in the bottom of that. That's the compost area. And then the moisture and other stuff that is in those worm castings, that's going to drip down through the second bin into that bottom one, where you're going to collect that leachate. And if you're really fancy and you really want to do it upright, you can put a little spigot down there to drain off that leachate so that you don't have to take it out, take the bins apart and get that leachate down at the bottom. So, but you don't have to have that. That's not necessarily necessary. If you do that, then you need to put some little supports underneath it so that you can put that tap in there to do that. So you can get a purchased worm box as well. This is an example of one. You can $50-$60 all the way up to 300 something if you want to get super fancy. Here's some worm towers. They look kind of nice. The green one on the left, that's got the fancy spigot so that you can collect that leachate. And then there's just the tubs there, the green tubs in the middle. You've got the worm bag in the middle. That's interesting. So, I mean, you can go super fancy or you can just do simple. I mean, it's just whatever works. So worm byproducts, that's going to be your worm castings. And those, like I said, you can get like a 5-pound bag, and you can pay anywhere around $20 to $25 for that. 5 pounds. That's not much. If you think about, you get a bag of, 25 or 30-pound bag of soil, topsoil, you know, 5 pounds isn't much. So that's a lot of money that you're going to pay. So again, if you want to produce these on your own, you're going to save yourself a lot of money, and you're going to have a really valuable source of byproduct from these worms. The worm bin leachate, that's the stuff in that bin there that you see. You can use that as a liquid type fertilizer. And then worm tea, and I'll show you how to make that worm tea here in a second. But first of all, how do you get those castings? And that's a really good question. So you're going to use different methods. There's the vertical or light method. So you're going to take the old bedding that has the worms in it, and you're going to make a big volcano out of it, and then put a really strong light source at the top. So those worms are photophobic. I like to highlight the words, the little sciencey words, if you will. And that means that they don't like a strong light source. So they're going to move away from that. They're going to migrate back down into that volcano of bedding. And then you take the top part off and put it into a different container. Continue to do that, excuse me, every 15 minutes or so until you're just dealing with a pile of worms at the bottom. Bait separation method. So you put the new clean bedding over on one side, and you mix a food source they like into that bedding, and then you push all the old bedding with the castings off to the other side. They will migrate out of the old bedding to the new bedding where the food source is. And when they do that, then you can come back and harvest the old bedding with the castings. You can do a screen sorting method. There are some expensive screens, commercial grade. You don't need to do that. You can actually buy them, but you just get 1/4 inch or 8-inch hardware cloth, make a little frame, tack it down, and then you just shake it out like you're going panning for gold, black gold. All the worms and the coarser material will remain behind, and then the eggs and the casings fall through. You can separate out the eggs if you want to. And then, you know, you've got your worm castings there. You can also do the tarp sorting method, where basically you just dump it out on a tarp and you pluck all the worms out and you get the egg casings. And then the rest of it is what you use for, you know, castings. So they can be used as soil additive, soilless mix, a tea or a slurry. And so for instance, if you use it as a soil additive, you put a handful in the planting hole. When planting propagating seeds, mix them in as a seed raising mix. So two parts coir to 1 part worm castings. And as a general soil conditioner, you can just kind of dig them through the soil. Before you mulch, you can spread a thin layer over the top and container grown plants. You can mix that in when you're repotting, 75% potting soil and 25% worm castings. So the soilless mix is going to be about 40% castings, 30% perlite, and 30% vermiculite. So the perlite's the white stuff, the vermiculite is the brownish stuff, and then the castings are the black stuff. Worm tea, you actually make this, and it's basically a natural fertilizer made from the worm castings, water, and a sugar. So you're going to use water, and this is the recipe. So, you know, again, I post this on that Metro Master Gardener page, so you can get that there. You put a pound of worm castings in a mesh bag, drop that in a 5-gallon bucket, cover about half with water. You're going to add a tablespoon of molasses or honey or something like that, and put a bubbler in there and just let it run for about 2 days. Then you're going to remove the bubbler and the castings, and you're going to mix with the remaining water that you've been withholding. So that is kind of a, a nice fertilizer, pretty easy to make, and your plants will definitely benefit for it. And you can buy that on Amazon also. It is also expensive. Leachate, it's that nasty liquid that drains out of the worm bin, and it may or may not have a bad mixture of microorganisms. So you remember I said you got to be careful about that pH and everything else. You really only want to use fresh leachate. So make sure to aerate if you're going to use this regularly. So basically it kind of boils down to you want to practice benign neglect. I did mention that you need to watch them a little bit, but you don't have to babysit your worms. So you don't need to overfeed them. You do have to keep adding bedding because they do eat that bedding. So it is important to add that periodically. You want to keep that bedding moist, but not too moist. So, somewhere 70, 80% moisture is good. You don't want to let them freeze. Don't leave them on your porch. If you left them on the porch over the Christmas break, it got into the single digits at night. They probably froze. So just be aware, they're a living organism. And since you've got them above ground, they don't have the benefit of being able to burrow down or go under something. So you have to put them in a sheltered location. And be sensitive to big changes in the worm box. So just like with IPM or integrated pest management, where you're out there walking your garden, flipping leaves over, being aware of what's going on in and around your yard and your garden, same thing goes here. You want to be aware of what's going on in the worm box. And don't let your worms overpopulate. Be willing to share. So if you have some, if you're a master gardener, share them with another master gardener, share them with your neighbors if they want to do that. They're kind of fun. And, you never know, you might need to go fishing and you won't have to go down to Walmart and buy that container of worms. You can just go hit your worm bin up. So there's some resources, lots of resources out there. I mean, you don't need to stick with just these resources. There are quite a few. And that is basically it. So I am going to stop sharing. I see a few things in the chat box here. Can you mix them? I'm not sure what you mean by mix them. You can unmute yourself if you would like.
You answered that when I typed it. Okay. It was about the composting mixtures. Can you mix the peat moss and the, yeah, that was all.
Okay. Yeah, you can definitely mix them. But you don't want to use grass clippings when a lawn service treats, correct? Yes. And that goes with anything. So, like if you have a lawn service that comes and sprays some type of herbicide, no, you don't want to use that. You need to allow it to water in, that kind of thing. But if it's fertilizer, a nitrogen fertilizer or something like that, you let it water in, but you're okay to use that after it's rained. Don't include the banana peel. You can, they don't like it that much and it will take them a while to eat it, but it's not bad. There are some things like citrus that worms really don't like and they just won't eat. Plus it increases the acidity in the bin. So citrus, we say no. Banana peel, yeah, you can put that there. There are things they like and they don't like. They're just like a toddler. Would worm composting be practical in a raised bed where you grow 2 to 3 crops in a year?